The year is 1860. Queen Victoria sits on the throne. Britain is a powerful empire full of industry and invention. In the small village of Road in Wiltshire, life is usually quiet and orderly. People know their neighbours. They go to church on Sundays. They believe in the importance of family and proper behaviour. Road Hill House is a fine, large home in this village. It belongs to the Kent family. Mr. Samuel Kent is a respected factory inspector. He lives there with his second wife, their children, and the children from his first marriage. From the outside, it looks like a perfect example of a comfortable, middle-class Victorian home, a place of peace and domestic harmony. But behind the neat curtains and the well-kept garden, things are not always as they seem. Victorian homes were often full of secrets. Families were expected to present a perfect face to the world, no matter what was happening inside. On the night of Friday, June 29th, a deep darkness settled over Road Hill House. It was more than just the absence of light. It was a cold, heavy feeling that would soon grip the entire nation. The gaslights in the grander city homes were a world away from this country darkness. Here, only candlelight flickered against the window panes, casting long, dancing shadows down the quiet hallways of the house. Inside the house, the family and their servants went to bed. There was the nursemaid, Elizabeth Gill, who slept in the nursery with the younger children. There were the older children from Mr. Kent's first marriage. There was Mr. and Mrs. Kent in their own bedroom. Everything seemed normal. The doors were locked, the windows were bolted, the house was secure, a fortress meant to keep the dangers of the outside world at bay. But the real danger was not outside. It was already within the walls, silent and waiting. No one could have imagined the horror that the morning light would reveal to them. That night, an unthinkable act took place. It was a crime so shocking it would tear the family apart. It would challenge everything people thought they knew about safety, family and justice. The peace of Road Hill House was about to be shattered forever. The crime would become a national obsession, a puzzle that would baffle the local police and require the skills of one of Scotland Yard's most famous detectives. The story of what happened in this respectable English home would become a dark and fascinating chapter in the history of crime. A true Victorian murder mystery that still captivates us today. To understand this mystery, we must first meet the people who lived in Road Hill House. The head of the family was Samuel Kent, a man in his late 50s. He was a factory inspector, a government job that gave him a respectable status in the community. However, he was also known for having a difficult temper. He had been married twice. His first wife had suffered from mental illness and had died some years before. He had 4 children from that first marriage who still lived at home: Mary Ann, Elizabeth, Constance and William. They were all young adults, living under their father's roof in a home now run by their stepmother. Mr. Kent's second wife was Mary Drew Kent. She had once been the family's governess, looking after the children. This was a common situation in Victorian times, but it often created tension. The older children especially may have felt that their new stepmother had replaced their own mother. Mrs. Kent now had 3 young children of her own, with Samuel, Mary Amelia, Francis Saville and a baby daughter. Our victim, Francis, who was known as Saville, was just 3 years old. He was a happy little boy, loved by his mother and doted on by his nursemaid. He was a symbol of the new family that had been created. The household also included several servants. This was typical for a middle-class family. There was the nursemaid, Elizabeth Garth, who was responsible for the nursery and the young children. There was a cook and a housemaid. In a large house like this, the family and the servants lived in separate worlds, but their lives were closely connected. The servants saw and heard everything that happened. They knew the family's secrets. Elizabeth Gow, in particular, was a key figure. She slept in the same room as the children she cared for. She would be one of the first to notice that something was terribly wrong. Living together in this big house was a complicated mix of people. There were the older children from the first marriage who might have felt resentful. There was the stepmother trying to manage her new family. There was the stern father who demanded respect. And there were the young children, innocent and unaware of the tensions around them. This complex web of relationships is crucial to understanding the crime. The police would soon discover that the peaceful-looking family portrait was a lie. Hidden beneath the surface were feelings of jealousy, anger and resentment, powerful emotions that could lead to a terrible crime. The morning of Saturday, June 30th, 1860, began with a cry of panic. Elizabeth Gough, the nursemaid, woke up as usual. She looked over at the little cot next to her bed where 3-year-old Frances Saville Kent was supposed to be sleeping. But the cot was empty. The blankets were still tucked in, as if the child had been lifted out carefully. At first, she might have thought his mother had taken him into her own bed, as she sometimes did, but a quick check with Mrs. Kent proved this was not the case. The little boy was not with his parents. He was nowhere to be found in the nursery. Panic quickly spread through the house. The family and servants began a frantic search. They looked in every room, every cupboard, and under every bed. Mr. Kent, growing more and more alarmed, organized the search. They checked the gardens and the outbuildings, but there was no sign of the little boy. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The family was bewildered. How could a child disappear from a locked room in a house that was securely bolted for the night? The drawing room window was found to be slightly open and the shutter unbolted, but it seemed impossible that a stranger could have entered without making a sound. As the morning wore on, a terrible fear began to set in. This was no longer a case of a missing child who had wandered off. This was something far more sinister. The local police were called, but they were just as confused as the family. They searched the grounds again. 2 local men, a farmer and a shoemaker, joined the search. It was one of these men who made the dreadful discovery. In an outdoor privy, a small brick building used as a toilet at the edge of the property, they found the little boy's body. He had been pushed down into the pit, hidden beneath a blanket. The discovery of the body confirmed the family's worst fears. This was not a kidnapping, it was murder. The child's throat had been cut so deeply that he was almost decapitated. There was also a stab wound on his chest. The news was devastating. The quiet, respectable Road Hill house had become the scene of a brutal and horrifying crime. The shock was immense, not just for the family, but for the entire village. Who could do such a thing to a small, innocent child? And more disturbingly, all the evidence suggested that the killer was not a stranger who had broken in. The killer had to be one of the people who had slept in the house that night. The news of the murder at Road Hill House spread like wildfire. First, it was just whispers among the villagers of Road. They gathered in small groups, speaking in low, shocked voices. They couldn't believe such a terrible thing could happen in their peaceful community, and to a respectable family like the Kents. The crime was so brutal and the victim so young and innocent that it was almost too horrible to imagine. Everyone had a theory. Some believed a madman was on the loose. Others whispered that the killer must be someone inside the house, a terrifying thought that made people look at their own neighbors with new suspicion. Soon the story was picked up by the national newspapers. In the Victorian era, newspapers were becoming incredibly popular. They were the main source of information for most people. The Road Hill House murder was the perfect story for them. It had everything: a wealthy family, a shocking crime, and a deep mystery. Reporters descended on the small village. They wrote sensational articles filled with dramatic details about the crime scene and the grieving family. They printed illustrations of the house, maps of the grounds, and portraits of the key figures. The public was fascinated and horrified, and they eagerly bought every newspaper to read the latest developments. The intense media coverage put huge pressure on the local police. Every detail of their investigation was reported to the public. People followed the case like a serialized novel, discussing the clues and suspects over their breakfast tables. The newspapers didn't just report the facts, they also shaped public opinion. Some papers suggested the nursemaid, Elizabeth Gough, was the guilty one. Others pointed the finger at the father, Samuel Kent. These accusations were often based on rumor and speculation, but they had a powerful effect. The Kent family found their private grief turned into a public spectacle, their secrets exposed for all to read. This public fascination turned the case into a national obsession. It was discussed in homes, in pubs, and on the streets. People felt a mix of fear, curiosity, and a strange kind of entertainment. The murder challenged their sense of security. If a child could be murdered in his own home, in a respectable middle-class family, then was anyone truly safe? The case highlighted the dark side of the seemingly perfect Victorian family. It forced people to consider that terrible things could happen not just in the poor, dark alleys of London, but also behind the closed doors of a fine country house. The local Wiltshire police were completely overwhelmed by the case. They had very little experience with such a complex and high-profile murder. They interviewed the family and the servants, but honestly, their stories were confusing and, well, often contradicted each other. The investigation was just going nowhere, and the public, stirred up by the newspapers, was demanding answers. The pressure became so great that the local authorities decided to ask for help from the best. So they sent a request to Scotland Yard in London asking for one of their top men to be sent to solve the crime. This was, a new and exciting development in policing. The man who arrived in Road was Detective Inspector Jonathan Jack Wiltshire. He was one of the original 8 members of Scotland Yard's new detective branch, founded way back in 1842. These men were a new breed of police officer. They didn't wear uniforms. Instead, they worked in plain clothes, using their intelligence and powers of observation to solve crimes. Wiltshire was, without a doubt, one of their most famous and respected detectives. He was 45 years old, a quiet and thoughtful man, known for his sharp mind and his ability to piece together clues that others had missed. He was really the real-life version of those fictional detectives that were just beginning to appear in stories. Wiltshire's methods were very different from those of the local police. He was methodical and professional. He began by carefully examining the crime scene again, looking for even the smallest details. He re-interviewed every member of the household, listening carefully to their words and watching their behavior. He wasn't interested in local gossip or wild theories. He was looking for hard evidence. He paid close attention to the physical clues, like the state of the drawing room window and the missing piece of flannel from the child's blanket. Wiltshire believed quite strongly that the answers to the mystery were hidden within the house and the family itself. The arrival of the famous London detective created, well, a great deal of excitement. The newspapers reported his every move. People hoped that this brilliant investigator would quickly unmask the killer. However, Wiltshire's quiet and secretive style frustrated some people. He did not share his thoughts with the press or the local police. He worked alone, slowly building his case. He represented a new, more scientific approach to crime solving. His investigation at Road Hill House would become a landmark case, demonstrating the power of professional detective work even when faced with a wall of silence and deception from a secretive family. Inspector Wiltshire soon came to a shocking conclusion. He believed that the murderer was not a servant or an outsider, but a member of the Kent family. Specifically, his suspicion fell on Constance Kent, the 16-year-old daughter from Samuel Kent's first marriage. Wiltshire was a careful observer of people, He noted Constance's strange, unemotional behavior. She seemed detached and unaffected by the terrible event that had thrown the rest of the household into chaos. He also learned about the deep tensions between the children of the first marriage and their stepmother, Mary Kent. There was a history of resentment and jealousy. Wiltshire began to build a case based on circumstantial evidence. He discovered that one of Constance's night dresses was missing. He believed she had worn it during the murder and had destroyed it afterwards to hide the bloodstains. He reasoned that the killer needed to be familiar with the layout of the house to move around silently in the dark. Constance, having lived there for years, knew every corner of it. Wiltshire theorized that her motive was jealousy. She resented her stepmother and the new children, especially the little boy, Saville, who was his father's favorite. The murder, in Wiltshire's view, was an act of revenge against her stepmother. However, Wiltshire's theory was met with disbelief and outrage. The idea that a young, middle-class girl could commit such a brutal and cold-blooded crime was unthinkable to most Victorians. People wanted to believe that evil belonged to the lower classes or to madmen, not to a seemingly respectable young lady. Constance was just a girl. How could she have the strength to kill the boy and carry his body downstairs and outside? The family, especially her father, strongly defended her. They portrayed her as a gentle and innocent child, and they turned public opinion against the detective. Wiltshire decided to take a bold step. He arrested Constance Kent on suspicion of murder. This caused a huge public outcry. The newspapers, which had once praised the detective, now questioned his judgment. They accused him of persecuting an innocent girl. Without a confession and with only circumstantial evidence, the case against Constance was weak. The local magistrates, who were friends of the Kent family, refused to commit her for trial. Constance was released and Inspector Wiltshire returned to London in defeat. He was publicly humiliated and his career was damaged. It seemed the Road Hill House murder would remain an unsolved mystery. After Constance Kent was released, the official investigation stalled. The local police had no new leads and the trail went cold. For 5 long years, the murder of Frances Seville Kent remained a dark cloud hanging over the village of Road and the nation. The public, though still fascinated, slowly moved on to other headlines. The Kent family tried to return to some kind of normal life, but the suspicion and the tragedy had broken them. They eventually sold Road Hill House and moved away, hoping to escape the terrible memories and the accusing stares of their neighbours. The case became one of Britain's great unsolved crimes. During these years, Constance Kent's life took a different path. Shortly after her arrest and release, she was sent away to a convent school in France. This was a common way for Victorian families to deal with a difficult or embarrassing daughter. It removed her from the public eye and the gossip surrounding the case. Later, she returned to England and chose to live in a religious institution in Brighton. She dedicated herself to a quiet life of work and prayer. To the outside world, it seemed she had put the past behind her, finding peace and purpose in her new life. But the secret she carried was a heavy burden. Meanwhile, Inspector Wiltshire never forgot the case. He remained convinced that he had been right. He had identified the killer, but the attitudes of the time and the class prejudice of the local magistrates had prevented justice from being done. The failure to solve the Road Hill House murder was a professional embarrassment for him. He had staked his reputation on Constance's guilt, and her release made him look foolish. The case haunted him, a puzzle he had solved but could not prove. He continued his work as a detective, but the shadow of this unsolved mystery followed him. The years passed. The great house stood empty for a time, a place of local legend and ghost stories. Other people tried to solve the mystery. Amateur detectives wrote books and articles, each with their own theory. Some still blamed the nursemaid, Elizabeth Gough. Others pointed to the father, Samuel Kent, suggesting he had been having an affair with the nursemaid, and the child was killed to silence him. The mystery deepened with time, becoming a classic example of a locked-room puzzle where the most likely suspects seemed to have been cleared. Justice for little Saville Kent seemed impossible. Then, in 1865, 5 years after the murder, something extraordinary happened. The case that everyone thought was closed forever was suddenly blown wide open. Constance Kent, now 21 years old, walked into a church in Brighton and sought out a clergyman, Reverend Arthur Wagner. In the privacy of his study, she made a full confession. She told him that she, and she alone, was responsible for the murder of her young half-brother, Frances Saville Kent. It was a moment of incredible drama, the final, shocking twist in a story that had gripped the nation. Reverend Wagner was bound by the sanctity of the confessional, but Constance was determined to make her guilt public. She wanted to clear her conscience and face the consequences of her actions. With the clergyman's help, she wrote a formal statement and turned herself in to the authorities. The news of her confession sent shockwaves across the country. The public was stunned. The young woman who had been defended as an innocent victim 5 years earlier was now admitting to one of the most infamous crimes of the century. Everyone who had doubted Inspector Wiltshire was forced to admit that he had been right all along. In her confession, Constance explained her motive. She stated that she had done it out of revenge against her stepmother, whom she hated for the unhappiness she had caused her own mother. She felt that her father's affection had been stolen by his new wife and children. By killing the little boy, she was striking a terrible blow against the woman she despised. She described how she had waited until the house was quiet, taken the child from his cot and carried him outside to the privy. She admitted to cutting his throat with a razor she had stolen from her father. It was a cold, calculated and terrifying confession. The trial was a formality. With her detailed confession, there was no doubt about her guilt. The public was horrified, but also fascinated by the psychology of the crime. How could a young girl be capable of such a thing? Her case raised difficult questions about female criminality, mental health, and the hidden tensions within the respectable Victorian family. Constance Kent was found guilty of murder. Because of her youth at the time of the crime and her gender, her death sentence was commuted to life in prison. The great mystery of Road Hill House was finally solved, but the story was far from over. Constance Kent was sent to prison to serve her sentence. She spent 20 years behind bars, first at Millbank Prison and then at Fulham Refuge. She was reportedly a model prisoner, quiet and hard-working. She was released in 1885 at the age of 41. After her release, she changed her name and disappeared from public view. She emigrated to Australia with her brother William, where she lived a long and quiet life, working as a nurse. She died in 1944 at the age of 100, having carried the secret of her terrible crime for almost her entire life. Her story is a powerful reminder of how a single act of violence can shape a person's entire existence. The case had a profound impact on the police and the art of detection. Inspector Wiltshire was vindicated. His reputation was restored, and he became a celebrated figure, a hero of detective work. The Road Hill House murder proved the value of the professional, methodical detective over the bumbling local constable. It showed the importance of psychological insight and paying attention to small, circumstantial clues. The case inspired a generation of writers, including Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens, and helped to create the genre of the detective novel. The public's fascination with the real-life detective paved the way for the fictional genius of characters like Sherlock Holmes. The murder also forced Victorian society to look at itself in a new, uncomfortable way. It shattered the myth of the perfect, peaceful, middle-class family. It revealed that behind the elegant facades of respectable homes, there could be dark secrets, jealousy, and violence. The case made people question their most basic assumptions about childhood innocence and female nature. The idea that a teenage girl from a good family could commit such a horrific act was deeply disturbing. It opened up public conversations about mental health, the pressures of family life, and the hidden emotional turmoil of women and children in a patriarchal society. Today, the Road Hill House murder is remembered as one of the most significant crimes of the 19th century. It is more than just a chilling story. It is a window into the Victorian world. It tells us about their families, their fears, their newspapers, and their developing system of justice. The case of Constance Kent and the brilliant work of Inspector Wiltshire marked a turning point in the history of crime and detection. It showed that the truth could be uncovered, even when it was hidden within the darkest corners of the human heart and the most respectable of homes.